Welcome back. This time we're talking about Star Trek Into Darkness, which originally hit theaters in 2013, 4 years after JJ Abrams and company rebooted the Star Trek franchise. Now, like my video for Star Trek, this is going to be an in-depth review with a lot of discussion about the specific things that I liked and didn't like about this movie, and thus it's going to have spoilers. So if you have not seen Star Trek Into Darkness, this is your warning. Stop this video now. Go watch the movie if you want to, and then come back and watch this video. So in my review for Star Trek, I repeatedly said that despite that movie's flaws, I really enjoyed it and felt it was a good installment in the Star Trek franchise. I also alluded to the fact that in the case of Star Trek Into Darkness, I did not feel the same. And in fact, when the movie came out in 2013, I gave it a pretty middling review. So rewatching the film in preparation for this video, as well as the release of Star Trek Beyond, I have to point out that this was actually the first time I had rewatched this movie since seeing it in theaters. And I do have to say, I did enjoy it a bit more than I did originally. Although it's not really because I felt the movie was better this time, it was more due to the fact that I knew what flaws were there, so I wasn't surprised and I wasn't disappointed by them. Now that's not to say this is a truly bad movie. It's just a film that suffers from many of the same flaws that Star Trek did, only in this case, they're much more noticeable and much harder to ignore. But before I get into some of the specifics, let me talk a little bit about the plot. And really, this is a very convoluted story with a lot of things going on, and trying to come up with a succinct way to sum this up is actually pretty hard. My first attempt at this ran almost 10 minutes, and it's like, no, that's ridiculous. So basically, we have the Enterprise, we have our crew, we've got Kirk, we've got Spock, we've got Scotty, and everybody else, and Starfleet is under attack by one of its own, this operative named John Harrison, played by Benedict Cumberbatch. And after killing a number of people, as well as Starfleet top brass, including Admiral Pike from the first movie, he is public enemy number one. And the Enterprise is sent off to essentially kill him. He has escaped to the Klingon homeworld, and they're sent on this kill mission, which upsets a number of the crew members. Scotty actually resigns his commission, but Kirk, wanting revenge for Pike's death, is willing to go along, at least at the beginning, with this whole operation being led by an Admiral Marcus, played by Peter Weller. Of course, we ultimately discover that this John Harrison is actually Khan, the classic Star Trek villain from the original series, as well as his own movie, Star Trek II, Wrath of Khan. And it turns out he was actually working with Marcus to create these new weapons to defend the Federation against an eventual war with the Klingons. And Marcus is determined to use this situation, including the Enterprise being on the border of the Klingon Empire, to essentially do two things: get rid himself of Khan and start this war in a way that will ensure the Federation wins. So all of this culminates in sort of a three-pronged battle going on between Khan, Marcus, and the Enterprise, ultimately leading to a almost scene-by-scene recreation of the final act of Wrath of Khan, and ultimately ending where Star Trek originally began, with the crew of the Enterprise leaving on their 5-year mission. So as I mentioned earlier, when I rewatched this movie, my initial reaction was, this is not actually as bad as I remembered it being. And again, this is a well-made, well-produced film. My issues are almost entirely with the script. And again, I was thinking, might not be as bad as I remember it being. But then as I was, kind of going over my notes and preparing for this video, much of the plot just essentially falls apart. I don't want to be the nitpicker. That's not what I'm interested in. But these are serious plot problems. Either plot holes or just flaws with the villains. And this was a movie that's very obviously trying to be a highbrow sci-fi Star Trek movie. So if you're going to aim that high, I've got to keep you to that standard. And if you fall well below that, I have to point it out. But before I get into the bad, let me get into the good. There are things I like about this movie. Principally the cast. all of the returning actors who are playing the Enterprise crew once again do a fantastic job in their performances. And you can really feel that they've settled into these characters, and at this point they know where they can kind of push the envelope here or there to really make these characters their own, so they're not just copying what's been before, while also playing homage to those performances in a really satisfying way. And the new characters, the actors, are also all top-notch. Even though I have problems with some of their characters, I have no problems with the acting of these characters. Benedict Cumberbatch is excellent as always as Khan. Peter Weller is great as Admiral Marcus. And Alice Eve is the third main new character in this movie. She plays Carol Marcus, Admiral Marcus's daughter, who is a character that we originally met in Star Trek III as the mother of Kirk's son. So her inclusion in this movie was a nice nod to the original canon, although frankly she's not given much to do in this movie except inexplicably showing us her underwear at one point. So that was a bit of a disappointment, that you bring in this character and it never really seemed like they knew exactly what they wanted to do with her. And on the production side, once again, this is a beautiful film to watch. The sets are wonderful, the cinematography is great, there's quite a bit less lens flares than there were in Star Trek. The action is well captured. The ship battles, there's a little bit more here than there was in the first Star Trek movie, and they're wonderful to watch. This is, as far as the action as it's captured on screen, this is an excellent movie in that regard. And as I've alluded to, my problems are with the script, not with the production. This is a well-directed, well-produced film. It just needed a better script. So like in my video for Star Trek, I want to touch on a few things that I have noticed in the progression of Star Trek to Star Trek Into Darkness to Star Wars A Force Awakens, a commonality of issues that I've had with all three of those films. And most of them, again, have to do with script, which I know Abrams did not write Star Trek or Star Trek Into Darkness, but these are trends that I have seen carried over to A Force Awakens, which he did write. And I'm not going to delve much at all into either of those other films, but while I could mostly ignore these issues in Star Trek, they have grown to a much larger degree here, and ultimately even more so in A Force Awakens. And the first one is, and I'm going to again blame this on Abrams because this carries over to A Force Awakens, is his concept of spatial distances. And here, this comes into play much more on a plot level than ever in Star Trek, which the main issue there was Spock being able to see Vulcan be destroyed in such a large fashion, and that was more of a, just as a conceit for visual effects there. Here there are serious plot related issues that have to do with spatial distances in this movie. And pretty much most of them relate to the idea of exactly where Kronos is, the Klingon homeworld, especially in relation to the border of the Klingon Empire. This is an empire. This should be a very large patch of space that we're talking about here. But in the movie, Marcus orders Kirk to park at the border of the Klingon Empire and fire photon torpedoes at Kronos to kill Harrison, or Khan. When I watched this movie back in 2013, I was confused. I was wondering whether this was supposed to mean that photon torpedoes in this canon have warp capabilities, because there should be in no way the border be close enough to Kronos. It would have to be within the Kronos system for them to be able to fire photon torpedoes and hit the homeworld. I mean, they do refer to them as long range, but let's not get crazy here. I suppose it could be possible, again in this new canon, that photon torpedoes could have warp capability. That appears very unlikely, even more so when we find out that most of the innards of these torpedoes have been replaced with cryo chambers containing Khan's compatriots. So I really thought the idea of warp-capable photon torpedoes pretty ridiculous, and I actually mentioned it in my original print review of the movie. But upon rewatching Star Trek Into Darkness, I realized I was mistaken. It's not that the torpedoes have warp capabilities. They're really actually apparently trying to tell us that the Klingon Empire's border is within sublight travel of Kronos. And we discover this in a number of ways. While the trade ship that they just happen to have in their hold that they use to get to Kronos could have warp capability, the shuttle that they use to do their experiment on one of the photon torpedoes with Carol Marcus, very unlikely that that has warp capability. I'm not aware of any shuttles from the original series time frame that have warp capabilities. And they're able to go to this planetoid that can sustain life. So they have to be within some planetary system. But the more concrete evidence comes when Marcus's ship is approaching the Enterprise. And at that point they don't know if it's a Federation ship or a Klingon ship that's approaching them. And Khan tells Kirk, as a way to say that this is Marcus coming to fulfill the evil deeds that he's been warning Kirk about, is that the ship is arriving in warp. Because if it was the Klingons, they would not be arriving in warp. And the only way that makes sense is that they're within a Klingon system. And my next issue on this subject is when the Enterprise flees Marcus's ship, trying to get back to Earth, and they're in warp for a few minutes. Essentially, they're in warp long enough for Carol to make her way to the bridge, warn Kirk about the capabilities of Marcus's ship, which it very quickly then demonstrates by firing on the Enterprise, knocking it out of warp. And they end up basically right by Earth's moon. And they actually say 237,000 kilometers from Earth. So apparently the border to the Klingon Empire, which is actually in the Kronos system, is only a few minutes by warp away from Earth. At least I guess that explains why Admiral Marcus is so worried about the Klingons. But adding on to that, so they're 237,000 kilometers from Earth. They were traveling at maximum warp, and there's nothing to indicate that they were preparing to exit warp when they were attacked by Marcus's ship. So in warp, by definition, that means they're traveling faster than the speed of light. Now a light second is 299,000 kilometers, meaning that they were less than a second away if they were traveling actually at the speed of light to Earth. Which means they should have been preparing to get out of warp long before they were attacked by Marcus's ship. And to compound matters, they were traveling at maximum warp, which in the Star Trek era I would say is probably somewhere around warp 5, warp 5.5. And using some calculations, using some information I got from Memory Alpha, a very good Star Trek database, they're traveling probably about 37 million miles per second. So again, this just doesn't add up. And many of these same problems will crop up again ultimately in A Force Awakens. Now the second common issue is the reliance on coincidences. And really this is probably of the three the least guilty of them. And a lot of the coincidences really are more of a byproduct of the overly complex and sometimes nonsensical plans of our two villains. And I'm going to get into that later. But I do want to talk on the third issue, and that is the system-breaking technology. In my video on Star Trek, I talked about the transwarp beaming technology and how it basically makes space travel obsolete. It's just way too overpowered. This is a technology that has never existed before in the Star Trek universe. And we see it abused here when Khan is able to transport himself from Earth all the way to Kronos. Although, as we've just discussed, that might not be as far a distance as we might have originally thought. But as bad as the transwarp beaming technology is, this movie gives us something even worse. And that is the serum created from Khan's blood that will essentially unkill anybody, as best I can tell. We had a dead Tribble. It's back alive. We had Kirk die from massive radiation poisoning. He's alive. And it seems like basically as long as you can get to someone who has just recently died, or put them in cryo sleep right after they die, you can pretty much cure anybody. I mean, I don't know how much physical trauma would be affected by this, but this is, I mean, it's almost ridiculous. And you could say, well, they're limited to Khan's blood. But you have 72 other people that were bioengineered that are now all just frozen in little tubes, and you can just go in and get their blood whenever you want to. And it's actually questionable whether they still need the blood. When Kirk wakes up at the end, Bones says that he was able to synthesize a serum. So this is a technology that just, again, completely breaks the system. Totally overpowered. And honestly, it exists solely so they could kill Kirk and do the homage to Spock dying at the end of Wrath of Khan. But really, that's enough on the repeated issues, because frankly this movie has plenty of its own. And let's start with the villains. First off, if one of your two villains is Khan, you don't need two villains. Especially if that second villain is essentially insane. And I don't know any other way to explain Admiral Marcus's actions in this movie other than he is completely unhinged and has little concept of reality anymore. So let's actually look at his plan. We have the terrorist attacks, we have the attack on the Starfleet brass, Pike is killed. And Marcus is in cleanup mode. He's trying to make sure Khan is destroyed before he can be found and linked to him and all of the violations that he's committed to create these super weapons. Enter Kirk, who wants revenge for Pike, and he wants to go on this mission to Kronos and capture Khan. So Marcus gets this idea of how he can kill like a dozen birds with one stone by sending Kirk on this mission. He gives him the photon torpedoes, which he knows contains the frozen comrades of Khan. So he's going to have Kirk go to the border, shoot these torpedoes at Kronos, killing Khan and killing all of the other frozen soldiers. And using Kirk and the Enterprise as scapegoats, their attack on Kronos will ultimately start a war with the Klingons, which Marcus will be able to win with his one ship. Yes, it's very superpowered and takes the Enterprise to the woodshed, but again, it's one ship against the Klingon Empire. And the other part of his plan that I just don't understand is the fact that he put these torpedoes with the bodies still inside. I mean, if he wanted to get rid of the evidence, he could have just like shot them into the sun or just blew them up somewhere else on like a test range. It makes no sense for him to give these particular torpedoes to the Enterprise, where they could be discovered. So let's move on to Khan. Khan is one of the best villains in the entire Star Trek franchise. And I have to say, I enjoyed Benedict Cumberbatch's performance here. I enjoyed the character of Khan in this movie. Unfortunately, like Marcus, his plans don't really make sense. We know he was working with Marcus on these super weapons, and he wanted to escape with his people and get out from under the thumb of Marcus. And one of the first things he did was steal all of his frozen compatriots and hide them in highly explosive torpedoes. I'm really not sure what his plan was with that, but it just seemed like a bad idea. Of course, he ultimately escapes. He thinks that Marcus has killed his family, and thus he goes on this plot of revenge. So he attacks this secret Federation base, possibly doing damage to Marcus's plans, but more importantly, getting all of the Starfleet brass to meet in one designated place. And instead of using another one of these little rings that apparently can make a huge explosion and make sure to kill everyone in the room, he fires on them from outside using some kind of weird shuttle thing. ensuring that he can not be sure that he's actually going to hit his target. And then after Kirk disables his ship, he uses the transwarp beaming technology to go to Kronos, which makes sense. I mean, obviously they're in a non-extradition territory, but he's in an uninhabited area of Kronos, where I'm pretty sure if the Klingons find him, they'll kill him. And he's in the one place that Starfleet knows he is. Now, Marcus's original plan to shoot the torpedoes at Khan never really made sense to me, because it made absolutely no sense for Khan to stay there. They knew he was there hours ago, and it was going to take time, well, maybe not, to actually get to the Klingon border so they could fire these torpedoes. Why would he still be there? Of course, it turns out he is still there, and he's there to get the message about the torpedoes, and he realizes that apparently Marcus is insane enough to use those very same torpedoes. But it never really explains what was his next step in his initial plan before things changed when he found out that his people were still alive. I don't know, because the movie never tells us. And really, compared to Marcus, this is not a huge issue. They're just questions that I have about his motives and his plan. And you know, a villain is only as good as his plan and his motives are, unless you're, wanting to watch the world burn like the Joker. And frankly, Khan, up until the final act of this movie, is fine. He's acceptable. I enjoyed the performance. I enjoyed the character. But then they sort of turn him into like Rasputin, where they kind of kill him multiple times, but he always comes out unscathed. I have no idea how they could have had 72 torpedoes go off inside Marcus's super ship, this Dreadnought class, and Khan still be able to actually fly it, let alone still be alive. Then, of course, he crashes it into Earth. He survives that, too. And then have this long, protracted fist fight with Spock, gets stunned multiple times by Uhura, and then finally knocked out by Spock. It just wasn't a very good run for that last act for Khan. Now, moving on, there's a couple other issues I have with this movie. Aside from the friendship between Spock and Kirk, there's not a lot of emotional payoff with the characters in this movie. A lot of the motivations of these various characters come down to almost political commentary. Now, Star Trek does have a very strong heritage on dealing with social commentary. And with any entertainment medium, there's a fine line between telling a story that includes and incorporates social commentary and downright preaching. And there are multiple times in this movie where it really felt preachy. You have the morality of targeted killings, you have the morality of the Federation creating new weapons, and then you have Kirk's speech at the end of the movie, talking about how we respond to being attacked. And it just felt very over the top in how it was handling these issues. And oftentimes it really felt like they went from like 0 to 60 with these issues. It's like when Scotty is objecting to the torpedoes being brought onto the Enterprise. It's like a shouting match, and now Scotty's, he's resigned. Oh, wow, that was like 30 seconds. That happened very quickly. So it's things like that in this movie that just, it's one more thing that kind of sapped the entertainment value out of this movie for me. And with a lot of movies, the more entertaining it is, the more I can forgive it its flaws. And I know this video is long. There is one last topic that I want to talk about with this movie. And it's not really a negative or a positive. It's just something that quite frankly shocked me when I saw it the first time. And it's still pretty shocking now, 3 years later. And that's Khan's final gambit. After the Enterprise thought it had destroyed his ship, he's able to crash it into Starfleet headquarters, which brings obvious allusions to the 9/11 attacks against the World Trade Center. And this movie arrived 12 years after those events. And as far as I can tell, as far as I can remember, this is the first summer blockbuster movie that involved a kamikaze-type attack in which a flying vessel is crashed deliberately into buildings. And like I said, this isn't saying this is a positive or a negative for this movie, but it was shocking and something I did feel was worth mentioning in this in-depth review. So to sort of sum all of this up, Star Trek Into Darkness is a well-made movie. The acting is great. The production values are great. The special effects are great. The cinematography is great. The script holding all of it together, however, is one that I have had major problems with when I saw it originally and when I saw it again for this video. And as I just said a minute or so back, the more entertaining a movie is, the easier it is for me to forgive its flaws. If you've seen my review for Star Trek Beyond, that's a movie that has flaws in its script, but it's a much more entertaining, much more fun experience than Star Trek Into Darkness is. And that was a movie that I just didn't enjoy as much as I did Star Trek or Star Trek Beyond. So for me, its flaws were much more glaring and much more detrimental to the experience. So I really would like to know what you thought of this movie and what you thought of my commentary on it. This is a movie that was pretty well received by both audiences and critics when it came out. I was sort of an outlier when I gave it a less than spectacular review. And I feel I'm probably still an outlier now. So do let me know what you thought of the movie, if you agree with some of the points that I've made, or if you disagree. Please, I do want to know. So if you want to keep up with my latest videos, click subscribe. As always, you can check out some of the other reviews on my channel. And until next time, I'll see you at the movies.